Hey everyone, Nathan here again, Absurd Being, Kierkegaard number 4. So today, no mucking around, let's just go straight to the diagram. And we can see today we are looking at the subjective versus the objective. So I've got some notes coming off that green box up the top, historical, speculative, and then under the subjective, becoming, inwardness, individual, hiddenness, and so on. And we'll look at all of those in turn today. All right, so let's make a quick start with the objective. So this is a critical pairing, these two, subjective and objective. Kierkegaard basically spends much of Concluding Unscientific Postscript talking about these two, and it's kind of the framework for the whole book. So the first part, the objective, he divides this into two, basically, the historical and the speculative. So on the historical view, well, actually, first of all, perhaps I should just say a little bit about the objective itself. So objective basically means external. It's things we can verify externally. So objective facts, objective knowledge, objective truth. These are all things that are outside the individual. And there are two parts to that, historical and speculative. And the first view, historical, talking about accounts from history, obviously, and he says these things that can never be more than approximation. So we can never know with any real certainty what actually happened if our only yardstick for this is historical objectivity. We typically think of the historical as being objective and absolutely true, but obviously there is, anything can be wrong, anything can be mistaken, anything can be inaccurately reported or deliberately misleading. So any kind of historical accounting is never rises above the level of mere approximation. So the result with this then, if we are looking at the historical for to ground our knowledge or to know, to come to an understanding of the truth, if we're looking to historical accounts for that, the result is that our decision, our ultimate decision about what to believe, what's true, what's false, is continually postponed, because it has to be postponed, because we can never be 100% certain. It's always merely approximate. We never get to absolute truth. So our final conclusion, our final result, is always delayed. It's always postponed. And the subject's personal, infinite, impassioned interest gradually vanishes over this time. So we lose that drive, that passion that characterizes an individual's striving and motivation. That fades because we can never achieve this certainty. Our truth is never more than approximation, and while we're waiting for it to be finally validated, when we're looking for that extra bit of proof that will put the nail in the coffin, we lose our impassioned interest. So he talks about that word postponed. He talks about that a lot in Concluding Unscientific Postscript. I think I'll just call that postscript from now on. He talks about that a lot, and it's this idea that it goes back to what we talked about in the last video, I think, about things never being complete in the external world. Things are never finished being. Human existence is never complete. It's always becoming. And and that means that if we're trying to kind of form a system or come to some kind of absolute truth, we're always postponing it until we get that final last bit of information in. But of course we never can get that last bit of information, because human existence is a perpetual becoming, continual becoming. So that's an interesting point to note. And I just wanted to clarify some of these things, some of these words that I mentioned before. So he says the subject's personal, infinite, impassioned interest gradually vanishes. So personal obviously relates to the individual, everything that Kierkegaard's about. Infinite, basically what he means here is beyond the finite, beyond the temporal, beyond the earthly. So he's talking about things like the idea behind whatever it is that you are considering, whatever it is that you're thinking about. He's going to the idea itself, which is infinite and not merely finite. And impassioned obviously relates back to the idea of passion, that idea of we have to be invested and resolute and committed in our decisions. So there's no objective proof in Christianity. And he lays his cards on the table here. So Kierkegaard really is we'll talk about this a little bit later, but he's like I saw it described somewhere. I saw him described somewhere as the ultimate anti-Christian, I think it was, which is a pretty good way of putting it. So he's attacking the idea that we can find certainty in Christianity, and Christianity deals in objective truth. So there's no objective proof in Christianity. He looks at the Bible, nothing, it's never more than approximation, right? He looks at the church, which never gets us any closer, because all of those, he talks about the way that the church has been unchanged for centuries, and the rites of confession and baptism, those things don't yield objective proof. I was baptized. Were you though? You have a piece of paper that says you were baptized, but what does that mean? Are you sure? Are you absolutely certain? Oh, my parents told me that I was. Well, that gets you a little bit closer, but it's still never more than mere approximation. You're always relying on someone else's account. And he also talks about the kind of the pedigree of Christianity. It's been around for such a long time. So perhaps that gives it some kind of validity. And he rejects that. You can't get any objective proof from that either. So Christianity doesn't trade in these objective truths. Now, the other part of this is the speculative side. And basically when Kierkegaard uses the word speculation or speculative, he's talking about philosophy. And that means he's talking about the rational. He's talking about reason and logic. And his general attitude towards this, he has respect for it, but he thinks it's the incorrect tool for investigating human existence and human life and the lived subject. So he has this to say about philosophy. It consists in getting more and more away from himself and becoming objective, thus vanishing from himself and becoming speculation's contemplative power. So let's just have a look at that in a bit more detail. Philosophy gets more and more away from the individual, from oneself. So it trades in reason and abstract concepts rather than with this focus on the individual, the lived individual, and that's what Kierkegaard's all about. So he says that it becomes more objective rather than subjective, rather than concerned with the individual, thus vanishing from himself and becoming speculation's contemplative power. So yeah, just drifting away from the concerned, engaged individual. Okay, so that is the objective, and now we need to turn to the other side, which Kierkegaard is more focused on, the subjective. Right, so the subjective. What does this mean? So basically, this is the opposite of the objective. It's a focus on the individual. So it's looking inward rather than outward. Now Kierkegaard talks about becoming subjective. And the whole thing, like I said, is concerned with the existing individual. And you might argue, or you might object, that this is quite trivial. I mean, the existing individual, well, we're all existing individuals, right? We get that comes with the terrain. There's no, what does it mean to say we become subjective? Well, actually, that's not true for Kierkegaard. For Kierkegaard, becoming subjective is the hardest task of all, simply because every human being has a strong natural bent and urge to become something else and more, namely to divest himself of his subjectivity in order to become more and more objective. So let's just have a look at that. Becoming subjective is the hardest task of all, because we all have a natural bent and urge to become something else and more. What is this? To divest ourselves of our subjectivity, become more objective. So that's an interesting quote, right? That the idea that we want to get rid of our subjectivity, we want to become more objective, we want to be more real in a way, we want to be more concrete, more tangible, more actual than we are. Now, if you've read Sartre, that is straight. I mean, that idea carries straight through into Sartre. The idea that we are, what's the phrase? A useless passion. That's it. So we're a useless passion because our goal for Sartre is to become in itself, for itself, right? Become a thing that knows that it's a thing. That's our ultimate goal for him, and that just seems to be coming straight from here. So that's what we want to do. We want to be more real. We want to be more concrete than we are, but we're not. When we don't have that fixed status, we don't have that completeness and wholeness that I talked about a couple of videos ago, which being has. We are always becoming. We never reach that total kind of fixed, locked as what we are. We're always becoming. And so becoming subjective for Kierkegaard is the hardest task of all, because we have to overcome that urge to lock ourselves down as some kind of thing, as a particular thing. Very interesting, and yeah, I mean that seems pretty solid to me. It's Sartre's whole idea of bad faith, trying to become something that you aren't, trying to fix your being in some way, identify yourself as something which can't change. You know, I am a waiter. That's what I am. And all of my actions and all of the things that I think and the things that I say and do go towards trying to fix my identity with that as a waiter. But I can never escape the fact that actually I'm freedom. Literally, I am freedom. I'm possibility. The possibility of being able. And that always means that I transcend whatever it is that I'm trying to be, I'm pretending to be. So becoming subjective, becoming inward, becoming a lived human being, an individual human being, is not easy, and it's something we have to work at. He also says that regarding becoming subjective, This task lasts as long as life itself. This life's task, that of living. So here, same kind of idea, this becoming subjective is not something we ever complete. It lasts as long as life does. As long as you're alive, you'll always have this task before you to become subjective. It's not something you can ever be finished with. It's not a task you'll ever complete. Which is cool to me. I mean, and that's, to me, that's what philosophy is too. That captures the essence of philosophy. It's not something you can wrap up and present as a finished system, because philosophy is centrally in philosophy, central to philosophy is the human individual. And as long as there is a human individual, or there are human individuals, philosophy will never be complete, and it shouldn't be. We shouldn't want it to be either. Any philosophy that can become complete and be finished isn't philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. So that's the task, becoming subjective, and it never finishes. I just noted here, don't confuse this with what we talked about in the metaphysical section of my diagram, where we talked about the self or spirit positing itself as freedom, that possibility of possibility. That was more like, the way I separate these two, that was more like the inception of consciousness. That was when one first becomes a conscious, existing being. This now is what we're talking about now, is after that's happened, after we've realized ourselves as freedom. Then we still have this task before us of becoming subjective, of making sure that we always focus inward, that our attention is always on the inward, and that we're always concerned with our existence as existing beings. So he talks also about a double reflection. And he says the inwardness of subjectivity is a double reflection. So this means it's more like a double movement, and he talks about this in a different context. But this double reflection is the way that we think the universal but exist as a specific individual. So there's kind of a not a clash, but there is a double movement, if you like. We operate through our thoughts at a universal level, at an abstract conceptual level, but whenever we always have to convert this, or take that universal conceptual, or those universal conceptual ideas, and bring them into a specific, particular individual life. So there's this, he calls that a double reflection. The way that we have to kind of manage, if you like, that. It's not quite a paradox, although it is a little bit paradoxical, the way that we have this universal and the particular, and we're both, right? We're both. So it is paradoxical, and we will talk about that later as a paradox, but we make this double reflection, or this double movement, because that's our nature. That's what it is to be a human being. We are infinite and eternal on the one hand, and so our thoughts carry us to the universal, to the eternal and the infinite. But all of this has to be converted, or taken up by a specific, particular individual in their life. So let me give a quote to further us along this train of thought. The thinker who, in all that he thinks, can forget to think it along with the fact that he exists does not explain life. He makes an attempt at ceasing to be a human being, to become a book or an object of something. So here he's talking about the thinker who ignores that second movement in that double reflection, ignores the fact that he exists, ignores the fact that he's a temporal, finite being. The person who does that and lives only in that abstract, universal realm doesn't explain life. He attempts rather to cease to be a human being. He's trying to become something objective. That's that temptation we talked about at the beginning of this section, to become a book or an object of something. Nice, and again, very, that's exactly what Sartre talks about. Another quote: the development of the subjectivity consists precisely in his actively implicating himself in his thought about his own existence, that he actually thinks the thought by making it actual. And again, there we're talking about this idea of taking that abstract, general, universal concept or idea and making it actual, living it in a specific, concrete life. And this is also reminiscent of what we talked about with thinking versus action in the last video, where the definition of action, remember, was that it cancels possibility and exists, and one, in acting, one cancels possibility and exists in the idea. So the idea is existed, it's lived, not thought. And that's the crucial point. It's making that double reflection. We've got the universal and we turn it into something concrete, something specific. Okay, so let's move on to kind of a conflict between the subjective and the objective. So he also talks about, actually I'll bring this up as well, he talks about, he often talks about it as a pair, a dichotomy, rather than the three spheres of existence. So you've got aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Often he talks about the first two, aesthetic and ethical, and compares those two. And when he's talking about the subjective, he often uses the word ethical in place of that. So the objective is clear. The objective is clear. It's the external, the world historical, the aesthetic. Right? It's the appearance. It's the temporary. Whereas he likens the subjective to the ethical. And when he says ethical, we'll cover this in more detail later, but it's good I should note it now. The ethical is subjective. He doesn't mean ethics, so like an ethical theory, or doing the right thing, or good versus evil, or anything like that. Ethical in this sense, the way he talks about it when he compares it and uses it as a synonym for the subjective, means relating to the individual, because ethics or the ethical for Kierkegaard is primarily about the individual. You can't have an ethics for a race, he says. Ethics is always focused on the individual actions, right? The actions of an individual. So it always comes back to that, which means it's always internal and directed towards an existing subject rather than the external world historical, the aesthetic. So the conflict that comes up here between the subjective or the ethical and the objective or the external can be captured in this quote. No matter what a person achieves in the world, be it the most astonishing, it is of doubtful worth all the same if that person was not ethically clear in making the choice and has not made the choice ethically clear to himself. So there, it's the value of doing something comes from the fact that it is ethical, that it's subjective, that it's inward. No matter what a person achieves in the world, it's of doubtful worth if the person was not ethically clear making the choice. So ethically clear again means subjective, and ethically clear in making the choice means the choice is made in inwardness. So one is directed to the individual, towards oneself. And making the choice ethically clear to himself means with kind of full awareness of what one's doing, knowing, understanding the distinction and the difference, and acting with full awareness of what one's doing. Acting ethically, and when one is acting ethically as opposed to acting with the external in mind. And we'll touch on this in just a moment, that same idea. But related to this, he talks about world historical knowledge, that kind of objective truth that we looked at the beginning. He talks about it using words like a snare and temptation. So it's very much he derides this kind of existence, just living he derides this kind of truth, this kind of focus on the objective, on the external. It's something we ought to avoid, and we ought to turn our attention to ourselves, inward. And this is another point that comes up in Heidegger, right? The idea of he talks about inauthenticity, and he uses similar words: temptation, falling prey. These kind of it's a trap. So there's interesting parallels running there. Let me give you a quick quote. Indeed, true ethical enthusiasm lies in willing to the utmost of one's ability, but never giving a thought to whether or not one achieves anything. Once the will begins to have half an eye for the outcome, the individual begins being immoral. So just drilling home that idea that it's all about inwardness. It's got nothing to do with external, with the objective, with the results. It's all about the intention, one's inward focus. So willing to the utmost of one's ability, never giving a thought to whether one achieves anything, ignoring the results, the consequences. And if you do that, once you do things with an eye to the outcome, then you have lost that ethical, that subjective dimension to your being. Now you are external. It's about the objective. You're becoming immoral. So he gives a couple of reasons clearly for this, that we ought not to be concerned with external results. The one is that we can only control our own internal subjectivity. We have no control over externalities. Very stoic kind of idea. And he also says whatever happens ultimately is because of God. So he plays the God card there. And that's out of your control. You can perhaps you can influence things, but ultimately God makes the final call. Things happen the way God wants them to, not the way you do. So all you can do is focus on yourself. Pay attention to you, inwardness. Inward. I just keep saying that, inwardness. And I'm going to say it again because Everything I've talked about so far is in the postscript, but I'm going to jump to the concept of anxiety, where he gives a definition of inwardness, and the definition he gives is the word earnestness. So he identifies inwardness with earnestness. But he says at the same time we have to be careful with definitions because they never capture the essence of a concept. And this is very cool as well, a very existential way of thinking about it. Definitions, descriptions, third-person accounts, these are all inferior. They're all insufficient because they never get to the heart of what the concept actually referring to, which is some kind of lived experience. And he compares this to someone who has loved, or he talks about the way that someone who has experienced love, been in love, will find a definition of love woefully inadequate, right? Someone who knows what love is because they've been in love, reads a definition of love, it's going to pale in comparison. So that's what he's talking about here. We've got to be careful with definitions, but we are limited to words. We have to use words and language. So we'll run with this idea of earnestness for now. So what is earnestness? So he expands on this here when he says, only an earnest personality is an actual personality, and only an earnest personality can do something in earnest. For to do anything in earnest requires first and foremost knowledge of what the object of earnestness is. So there's an interesting way of putting this. This is how vital earnestness is, and how important it is that one one understands what it is as a lived experience, rather than just reading a definition of it. Because if all you have is that third person description, that's not enough. That's never going to get you to earnestness. So the earnest personality is an actual personality. That's someone who's earnest is someone who's actual, concrete, real, engaged. And only an earnest personality can do something in earnest. For to do anything in earnest requires knowing what earnestness is. So you have to know, before you can do something in earnest, you have to understand what earnestness is, which means you have to live it. You have to experience it, not have read a dictionary definition of it. And so in a way, he's kind of saying, to do something in earnest, you first of all have to be earnest, and this requires that one be earnest about earnestness. You have to be focused on that. You have to turn your attention to that. You have to be resolute and committed to this task, becoming subjective, becoming inward. And that's the idea, I think, that he's trying to capture with the word earnestness. It's becoming subjective, or inwardness isn't about doing particular things. It's about how you go about those things. It's about the passion and the intensity you bring to the cause. Obviously, it is about what you do. There are things that you have to do, but it's more about how you go about that. It has to be done with that kind of that passion, and that earnestness. It has to be done in earnest. So I've got another quote which talks more about this idea of inwardness. So inwardness is an understanding, but in concreto, it is a matter of how to understand this understanding. To understand a speech is one thing. Understanding what is being pointed out to you is something else. To understand what you yourself are saying is one thing. Understanding yourself in the saying is another. So this is again cool, and just again revolving around this idea of it has to be concrete, lived, not abstract and thought. So yeah, understanding a speech is easy intellectually, but what you have to understand is what is being delivered, the contents of that speech. You have to understand what the idea behind the words. The same thing, understanding yourself, what you are saying is one thing, but understanding the individual in that saying, the individual behind the speech is a different thing and less easy. And I've got a longer quote here about this idea of being consciousness of oneself, which I'll read to you because I quite liked it. The most concrete content that consciousness can have is consciousness of itself, of the individual itself, not pure self-consciousness, but the self-consciousness that is so concrete that no author, not even one with the richest vocabulary, has ever been able to describe a single such self-consciousness, although every single human being is such a one. This self-consciousness is not contemplation, since anyone believing this finds that he has not understood himself on seeing that he is at the same time coming into being, and so cannot be something concluded for contemplation. This self-consciousness is therefore action, and this action, in turn, inwardness. Phew, that's a long quote, right? So there are only three sentences in there, and I want to pass this out by looking at each of those sentences individually in turn. So the first sentence is about being consciousness of oneself, and it's the most concrete content that one can have. So it's not an abstract, pure self-consciousness, but this self-consciousness, my self-consciousness, which is infinitely more than any description could ever hope to capture. So you could never describe this, you can only live it, you can only know what it is from the inside. The second sentence is about the idea that we're not talking about contemplation or reflection or thinking here, because the self is not complete. To contemplate or reflect or think on something requires that it be complete. One has to be able to view the object, whatever it is, the object in your mind, from all angles, or else you're never going to get the full picture, right? So whatever it is has to be complete. Human beings, human existence, the self-consciousness is never complete. So it's never an object for contemplation. And finally, the third sentence, the self-consciousness is therefore action, and action is inwardness. So again, that link back to the last video, not thinking but action, and action involves living the idea, not just thinking it or talking about it or writing about it or reading about it, but experiencing and living it. So there's a little note that I want to mention about others as well. So because this whole idea of being subjective, becoming subjective, is focused on inwardness, it means that there's no direct relation between one subject and another subject. As soon as I know another subject, his actuality is for me a possibility, and vice versa. So we can never know another subject in their inwardness, in their subjectivity. We can never know another subject as they truly are, as an inward, engaged, lived subject. So this means that, the consequence of this is that one human being cannot ethically judge another, because the one is only able to understand the other as possibility. We can never get through to them as who they are. So we can't judge them. We can't judge someone else ethically, because we don't know. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. All we see is the external, that they've become just possible for us. They're not actual in their core, the way that they are for themselves, the way that I am for myself. So we ought not to judge other people for that reason. Obvious religious, Christian sentiment there, or link. So that's basically the what I want to talk about today regarding the subjective and the objective. Let's have a quick look at a summary. So the objective, or the external, the world historical, I also called it the aesthetic. We divided it into two areas: the historical, which was never more than mere approximation, you could never get certainty, and the speculative, which was always rational, logical, abstracted out from the lived individual. So it never engaged with someone, with an actual existing subject. And then there was the subjective, which was basically the existing individual, characterized by inwardness, becoming, and existing. I think those three words capture the essence of what it means, of what subjectivity means, becoming subjective means for Kierkegaard. And we looked at that double reflection, where one is thinks the universal, but then has to convert or take that universal idea up and actually live it in a specific, particular instance or individual life. So that was the video, and let's just quickly look back to the diagram and just see what talked about, untalked about. Here we go. So anyway, the subjective and the objective, we looked at the historical, the speculative, so that's cool. And then down on the subjective side, becoming, inwardness, which we characterized as earnestness, that intense passion for the individual, for life as it is lived, not as it's known. So there was the individual, focus on the individual, and there's also that last section, hiddenness and deception, which I haven't talked about, mainly because we're going to look at that a little bit in the next video, actually, with the next section there, communication. But I'll just briefly mention it here. The reason I want to include it under that subjectivity, or that subjective idea, is that it is kind of crucial in Kierkegaard, and it occurs everywhere, this idea of deception and hiddenness. And basically it's important to highlight that here in this video, because it directly relates to the idea that subjective is inwardness, that idea that we can't know another subject as a subject. We can only know them as a possibility, as they exist in my world. For me, I'm the subject, I'm the lived experiencer here. They appear in my world, but so I can never get through to them, and they can never get to me. So me as a real existing subject, who I really am, is always hidden. It's always beyond whatever, beyond the grasp of anyone else, and I'm fundamentally unknowable to external third party. So that's an idea that really is, I guess in a way it's a consequence of this, the focus that Kierkegaard places on becoming subjective and this idea of inwardness. And just, well, we'll talk about it later. I'm not going to get into any more detail on that. So that's kind of a little bit about deception and hiddenness, and we'll talk about that more in the next video when we look at communication, as I said, and I'm repeating myself. So let me sign off here, and thanks for listening, as always, and I'll catch you in the next video.